What's up? And if you clicked on this video right here, you probably want to learn how to use these watercolors. This is actually the only video you have to see in order to understand and master water paints. So as you guys can see right here, I actually did buy myself a travel case with Aquarelle paints, and I would always consider you buying aquarelles and not watercolors, because watercolors are in most cases these student grade watercolor paints which have very low pigments in comparison to aquarelles. This one is from Winsor & Newton, but as you can see, probably all aquarelle paints will do it. And you don't really need a large case or a lot of colors, because you can actually mix most of the colors even with such a small palette like this. But the most important part about watercolor is actually the surface you are painting on, which is in most cases paper. And you don't have to buy such huge paper as I did. However, the most important thing you actually have to consider when buying and choosing your paper is the thickness. And you actually always want 300 GSM or even more considerable, but I would say the sweet spot is always like 250 to 300 GSM. This is the thickness of the paper, and because we are working with water, you actually don't want the water to get soaked in the first try. And I would always advise you to buy cotton paper, 100% cotton paper, because this one is actually the most durable. Trust me, I did find that out the hard way. But why do you want to buy such thick paper? Because even this thick paper right here gets this buckles because it soaks in all the water, and it can actually turn out really messy if you use thinner paper. And if you're painting first time with watercolors, don't be scared if the paper actually buckles up even when you're still painting on it, because you can actually get rid of these buckles very easily. When you've done painting with this paper, you actually turn it the opposite way on a flat surface and just paint a lot of water to the back, just water without color to the back, and just put in something to dry on and actually something heavy in order for it to flatten out. In this way, you can actually save a lot of buckled up paper. And I would always advise you to tape down the edges from your paper, because this way the buckling of the paper is actually drastically minimated. I always use some not very sticky tape in order to tape this drawing down, and I will always leave this on while I'm painting. But anyways, I will show you the right way to start, what you also need, and for this I'm going to switch to my desk setup. So as you guys can see, what I am using for my watercolor painting. So of course the watercolors, and you can always kind of mix those colors on this palette. You don't really need such a palette. You can also use this paint from tubes. Yes, there are watercolors from tubes, and you can just basically put and mix those colors on every surface, but plastic works the best in my opinion, or also glass. However, you also need 2 cups of water, one for the dirty pencil or brush and one with clean water. So yeah, basically there are 3 painting techniques for watercolors, and that is dry on paper, wet on paper, and very wet on paper. And I'll show you what the differences is. So basically we just use a bit of water, and I'm kind of mixing a bluish tone. As you can see right here, I'm using blue. And for the dry technique, you actually want to use a lot of color on this paper straight away. You see right here how the color behaves. You kind of actually push the color from one point to another, and the paper actually needs time to soak the paint in. And I am using this technique actually to paint very detailed details. So for watercolor painting, you actually are layering the colors, and you always go from bright to dark. So from light to shadow. And this technique is perfect for layering shadows when you painted the first layers. So I would always advise you to use this not from the very beginning, like you see right here on the blank paper, but to just add shadows. So The next technique is actually the technique I am probably using the most, because it is actually, you kind of make the paper wet, but only as wet as the paper just soaked in the water. And this is the state you want to have. This is actually just the paper is wet and is kind of shining, and you see that, but the water doesn't run off or something. It actually stays on the paper because it soaked it right away. You can always see that on this shining layer. And this way you can actually paint beautifully. Like you can see, you don't really need much color. And this is also the best way and state to mix colors together. Like you can see right here, like I said, you can actually mix colors very good on here. So I just used a bright blue and a darker blue, and as you can see, I can mix them pretty well together. And the paint is not really going off and on center like on the dry method. You can see it actually directly soaks into the paper, and you can see you can make beautiful transitions with this method. However, the third one is actually the most interesting one, because with the third method I am actually using it only for backgrounds in order to fill in large spaces and also make very smooth transitions. So you want to put a lot of water onto the paper, that much that the water actually doesn't get soaked right away into the paper. And if I would want to show you, the water would run away like it makes right here, like when I'm shaking, you know. The water is actually running off, and this way you can make also beautiful color transitions, and you can fill in large spaces with it without using much color. You see right here, the color is very beautiful, getting to every part with water on. And this way, like I said, you can also make beautiful transitions. I would always use this method in order to make very, very delicate and light transitions. And because the paper was already buckled up, you can see that the paint is collecting itself right here. And this is also something you really have to work with buckled up paper, where the paint is flowing. And in order to understand watercolor, you really have to understand how the water is behaving. Not only on paper in general, but also on your paper. Because your paper might have a texture or bulks or ridges to it, and you really want to understand that if this paper is not flat, the color is collecting itself in one space. And if it's drying right here, you can see you have kind of more color on this spot right here than on the corners, and here it will be the direct opposite. You have a lot of color right here and right here, but here you have a lot less color because it is actually collecting it right here. And like I said, watercolor is basically just waiting for it to dry and layer something over it, but there's always a good technique in order to not really start from the beginning with a new layer. If the paper is still not fully dried and the color is on it, you can actually take clean water and reactivate the paint like I do right here. You can see it was dried out, but with a little bit of water you can actually reactivate the paint and mix some other colors in, like you can see right here. So this way you can actually experiment a lot also with transitions and color theory combos. I just like to work with a huge brush in order to get these smooth color transitions like you see right here. And what brushes do you actually want to use? I don't really have special brushes. However, there's one thing you really have to have when you buy some brushes. They have to be really, really soft. And I mean very, very soft. Because watercolor is very delicate, and you basically saw how I just did push the paint away and around. And with a hard brush, you're basically just scraping off all the paint from the paper again and again because you're reactivating it. And it doesn't really look like soft watercolor or aquarelle paints you want to achieve. So there's also a quite cool trick I want to show you. To a degree, like I said, you can actually erase watercolors. So for example, I am actually painting a bit of watercolor right here, not too dry, and the watercolor is still wet. I can actually use a paper towel and just smudge away the color I don't want. In this way you can kind of erase watercolors when they're still wet. However, trust me, it actually only works when it's still wet and not too much pigment, because with too much pigment it kind of looks like this and you don't want to smudge your watercolor painting. And if you are as spoiled as me, you do have something like a masking pen. So what that is actually, in order to paint very crisp corners, you cannot really layer watercolor paintings because they are very opaque, and I didn't want to paint the background over this wing in order for it to just basically paint over it and the color is turning out very dark because of the background. I did use this masking pen. So what that actually is kind of like a fluid gum, which actually, when it hardens, it becomes kind of like rubber, and you can actually peel that rubber off and you can paint over it once it's fully dried. And in this way you can actually preserve the paper you also want to paint over, but not at this point. So yeah, that is everything I actually know about watercolor. And one important thing is that if watercolor is drying, like you can see right here, the colors turn out very bright. Like for example, you can see right here, the colors are actually always brighten up. So even if I am using the color black and it actually looks very dark and black on the paper, trust me, if you let it dry for like half an hour and you come back, it is actually turning out gray, which is why I do say watercolor paints are actually designed to layer it. So this is actually everything I do know about watercolor painting, and if you do have questions for me, just leave them in the comments down below. You can always check out my profiles, links are also in the description if you are interested in my paintings and fantasy art. I do also a lot of tutorials in the future, so if you're up to that, just subscribe for free, and I would say we'll see us in the next video. Peace.